Our cat, Cosmo, had been a fixture of our family's routine for as long as I could remember. He was a handsome tuxedo cat, mostly black with a white chest and paws, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a creature who knew he was secretly in charge. Part of that routine, a rule as unshakable as dinner at 6, was that Cosmo slept in the basement. My parents, particularly my fastidious father, couldn't stand the fine layer of black and white fur he'd shed on their bedspread. It was a fair point, I suppose. Cosmo was also an indoor-outdoor cat, a phantom who roamed the neighborhood by day and returned for his evening meal. If left to his own devices at night, he'd inevitably demand to be let out at some ungodly hour, his yell echoing through the house like a tiny, furry banshee. So, into the basement he went. The basement wasn't a punishment. It was a kingdom, spanning the entire footprint of the house. It was a sprawling, semi-finished space with old couches, a dusty ping-pong table, and my dad's workout equipment. It was his domain, and for over a decade he never seemed to mind. He'd be scooped up, deposited on the small landing at the top of the stairs, and after a moment's pause, he would descend into his subterranean realm for the night. That all changed about 2 weeks ago. The shift was subtle at first. I was the last one up, a common occurrence for a teenager running on a nocturnal schedule. I found Cosmo dozing on the living room rug, a familiar sight. I picked him up, his body going limp in my arms in trusting acceptance, and carried him to the basement door. I placed him gently on the linoleum landing, whispered, "Good night, buddy," and shut the heavy wooden door, the click of the latch echoing in the quiet house. I had performed this ritual thousands of times, but as I stood in the kitchen filling a glass of water, something broke the pattern. A soft questioning meow came from behind the door. Then another, more insistent. That was strange. He never lingered. Usually, the pull of his favorite armchair downstairs was immediate. I thought maybe my sister Maya had forgotten to fill his food bowl. I walked back to the door, the cool floorboards chilling the soles of my feet, and turned the knob. The moment the door cracked open, Cosmo bolted out, not with the leisurely stretch of a cat changing its mind, but with a frantic, desperate energy, as if escaping a predator. He shot past my legs and disappeared into the darkened living room. I flicked on the landing light and peered down the stairs. The basement was still and silent. I checked his bowls. The food dish was full to the brim, and his water was fresh. "Weirdo," I muttered to the empty air, a knot of confusion tightening in my gut. I eventually found him hiding under the coffee table, his eyes wide and dark. It took some coaxing, but I managed to get him back to the landing, closing the door quickly before he could escape again. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. I heard nothing, and assuming the mystery was solved, I went to bed. The next 2 nights were a carbon copy of the first. I put him on the landing, and minutes later, the plaintive meows would start, a sound that grated on my nerves because it felt so fundamentally wrong. Each time I opened the door, I'd find him right there, pressed against the door, refusing to take a single step down into the darkness. He would stare at me, his green eyes pleading, before looking back towards the top of the stairs with an expression of pure dread. The thought flickered through my mind that maybe this was just old age, the beginning of a decline I didn't want to face. It was easier and crueler to ignore him. I'd shut the door on his cries, telling myself he'd give up and go downstairs eventually. The silence that followed was always more unsettling than the meowing. Then came the day he wouldn't enter the house at all. He spent the afternoon curled up on the welcome mat, a stoic little statue. I opened the door, making kissing noises to entice him in, but he didn't budge. He just looked up at me, a low rumble in his chest. I went out and sat, with him, stroking his fur, which felt unusually coarse. He seemed tense, coiled, his gaze constantly drifting towards the back of the house. As evening fell and the air grew colder, I knew I couldn't leave him out. I scooped him up in my arms, and for the first time in his life he struggled against me, a flurry of contained panic. I held him tight and carried him inside, deciding to break the cardinal rule. That night, Cosmo slept in my room, curled into a tight, trembling ball at the foot of my bed. He seemed calmer, but he didn't truly relax. He was a sentry on duty, his head snapping up at every creak and groan of the old house. The following days brought a new mystery. Someone keeps leaving the basement door open. My dad boomed one evening, his voice laced with the unique frustration reserved for wasted electricity. He was convinced the unair-conditioned basement air was seeping upstairs and driving up the built. His suspicion immediately fell on Maya, who was notoriously forgetful, leaving a trail of open cabinets and drawers in her wake. She denied it, but my dad wasn't convinced. I didn't think much of it, just relieved that with Cosmo sleeping in my room, the nightly drama had ceased. One night, I woke up with a start, pulled from a dream I couldn't remember. The house was thick with the oppressive silence of 3 a.m. My eyes, heavy with sleep, drifted towards my bedroom door, which I always left slightly ajar, and then I saw it. A shape, blacker than the surrounding shadows, was standing in the doorway. It was tall and perfectly still, a human silhouette outlined by the faint, ambient glow of the nightlight we kept on in the den down the hall. Sluggish and foggy, scrambled for a logical explanation. It had to be Maya. Maybe she was sleepwalking, or needed to ask me something. "Maya," I rasped, my voice a dry whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it moved, not with the stumbling gait of my sister, but with a fluid, deliberate retreat, melting back into the darkness of the hallway without a sound. A cold dread, sharp and sobering, washed over me. I was too terrified to move, too tired to process what I had just seen. I convinced myself it was a waking dream and forced my eyes shut, pulling the covers up to my chin. A couple of days later, the puzzle of Cosmo's behavior seemed to solve itself. My mum went into the basement to do laundry and came back upstairs, looking disgusted. "We have fleas," she announced. "The basement is crawling with them." It was a repulsive discovery, but also a relief. It all made sense. Of course, Cosmo didn't want to go down there. The strange part was the source. We'd never had a flea problem before, and Cosmo's flea collar was supposed to be his shield. My dad, ever the man of action, launched a full assault. He spent an entire Saturday in a mask and gloves, tearing through the basement like a general waging war. We vacuumed every inch of carpet, sprayed every corner with potent chemicals, and laundered every piece of fabric. He declared the basement off limits for a few days to ensure any survivors would starve without a host. I figured that was the end of it. The intruder in my doorway was relegated to a bad dream, and the fleas were being dealt with. But the house wasn't done with me. A few nights later, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, my eyes were drawn to the crack beneath my door. A light was seeping in from the hallway, but it wasn't steady. It was flickering, on and off, in a frantic, irregular rhythm. It was as if someone was standing in the hall, flicking the light switch up and down with manic energy. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. My first thought was my dad, up for a late-night snack, but this went on for too long. A minute, 2 minutes. The erratic flashes of light made the shadows in my room jump and writhe. A primal fear, cold and suffocating, kept me pinned to my bed. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at that sliver of flickering light and pray for it to stop. Finally it did, plunging the hallway back into darkness. It took over an hour for my heart rate to return to normal, and sleep felt like a distant, impossible luxury. When my dad finally gave the all clear for the basement, I was the first one to venture down. I'd missed having the space to myself, a place to blast video games without my family complaining. But as my feet hit the bottom step, a familiar sense of unease washed over me. I looked down at my socks, a tiny black speck, then another. They were still there. Not as many, perhaps, but a definite, thriving population of fleas. How was that possible? After the chemical apocalypse my dad had unleashed, they should have been annihilated. I called him at work, and he was dismissive, telling me to be patient, that the last few would die off soon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was wrong. Fleas need a host. They need blood to survive and reproduce. What were they feeding on? The next day after school, I decided I had to know. Armed with a flashlight, I descended into the basement, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I bypassed the main area and headed for the back, towards the unfinished storage room. This was the darkest, mustiest part of the basement, a place filled with forgotten Christmas decorations and rusty tools. If a rat or a squirrel had gotten in and died, this is where it would be. The moment I pulled open the door, the smell hit me. It wasn't the chemical scent of flea spray or the simple must of an old basement. This was a thick, gag-inducing stench of decay and rot, a smell so foul it made my eyes water and my stomach churn. It was the smell of death, following the putrid odor. I moved deeper into the room, my flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. The smell was strongest near the far corner, where a small, dark opening led to a crawlspace, a network of pipes and dirt that ran beneath the entire house. It was pitch black in there, a void that seemed to swallow the light. I could feel my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I turned to leave, to go get my dad, to tell him he had been right about a dead animal, and that's when I heard it. HHH. It was a sound so faint I almost missed it. A wet, shallow sound hidden beneath the hum of the furnace. HHH. Breathing. It wasn't mine. It was slow, steady, and it was coming from the crawlspace. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a terrifying energy. The breathing got louder, closer, as if whatever was in there was moving towards the opening. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet were cemented to the floor. I was paralyzed by a horror I couldn't comprehend. Before I could force my body to react, a figure lunged from the darkness. It was a blur of motion, a chaotic explosion of limbs from the black void of the crawlspace. A hand, skeletal and caked with filth, shot out towards me, its fingers like talons reaching for my shirt. A strangled scream ripped from my throat as I finally broke free, scrambling backward and stumbling over a stack of old paint cans. I didn't wait to see its face. I didn't want to know. I turned and ran, my breath catching in sobs, my feet pounding up the wooden stairs. I slammed the basement door shut, fumbling with the lock until I heard it click into place. The police came. They swept the house with flashlights and stern faces. Their voices a low, calming murmur that did nothing to soothe my frantic terror. They found the crawlspace, Tucked away in the filth and darkness were empty chip bags, crushed water bottles, and a makeshift bed of old blankets. He had been living in our walls, living off our food, breathing our air. He'd escaped through a storm door at the back of the basement I hadn't even known existed. The officer suggested it was likely a transient, someone homeless seeking shelter from the elements, but I knew it was more than that. The silhouette in my doorway, the flickering lights, the basement door left open, not to let the cool air out, but to let him in. He hadn't just been living in our house, he had been exploring it. He had been watching us. We have deadbolts on every door now. The basement door remains locked at all times, but the feeling of safety in this house is gone, shattered forever. Sometimes, late at night, I'll feel a draft and my blood will run cold. Every creak of the floorboards sounds like a footstep. And Cosmo, he still sleeps in my room, a furry guardian at the foot of my bed, but he will not go anywhere near the basement door. He just sits and stares at it, his tail twitching as if he can still hear the faint, steady breathing coming from the darkness below. He knew all along. He knew we were not alone. Halloween was the high holiday in our house. My parents, bless their hearts, were true believers in the spirit of the season. Every October they would embark on their grandest project, transforming our sprawling, creaky basement into a full-fledged haunted house. I'm an only child, and I think this annual production was their way of filling the house with the noise and chaos a larger family might have brought. It wasn't a professional gig, just a labor of love built from old decorations, a smoke machine my dad bought in the 90s, and an abundance of enthusiasm. The price of admission wasn't money, but canned food. At the end of the night, my dad would load up our minivan with boxes of donated goods and take them to the local food bank. It was our family's tradition, a perfect blend of spooky and charitable. We lived in Hatton, Pennsylvania, in a neighborhood of old, stately brick houses that seemed purpose-built for ghost stories. Our house was no exception. It was a set colonial with floors that groaned like a dying man and hallways that seemed to gather shadows. It had an inherently eerie vibe that my parents expertly amplified for their haunted house. To help manage the chaos and provide the scares, my 4 cousins, Jeff, Rick, Chaz, and Eric, would drive down for the weekend. They were older, cooler, and the architects of my childhood terror. That particular year, when I was 7, they decided to up their game. They bought matching anonymous masks, those hauntingly blank, white faces with the placid, knowing smirk. The idea was to create a sense of unified, faceless dread as they lurked in the darkened corners of the basement. The night of the event was a resounding success. The air was crisp with the scent of fallen leaves, and by early evening, a line of neighborhood kids and their parents snaked down our driveway. My parents later told me about the one oddity that occurred before the festivities truly began. A man had shown up alone, clutching a few cans of green beans. This was unusual. Our haunted house was explicitly a family event. He was a gaunt figure with restless eyes that didn't quite seem to focus. He explained that his wife and daughter were coming later, but he wanted to drop off the donation early. My parents, ever polite, thanked him and took the cans. He lingered for a moment too long, his gaze sweeping over the front of our house with a strange intensity before he finally got the hint and departed, leaving my parents with a faint sense of unease. Once things kicked off, the basement became a maelstrom of delighted screams and nervous laughter. I ran through the maze of black-draped sheets with my best friend Sarah, our hands clasped tightly together. The strobe lights made everything feel fractured and unreal, and the creepy organ music my dad piped through a Bluetooth speaker was perfectly chilling. My cousins were masters of the jump scare, and I took a certain pride in knowing the monsters were my own family. At one point, as we navigated a section filled with fake spiderwebs, Sarah squeezed my hand so hard I yelped. I turned to look at her, and she was crying, her face pale in the flashing lights. "What's wrong?" I asked, my own fear starting to bubble up. "The man," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The man in the white mask." "It's just my cousin," I said, trying to sound brave. "It's probably Chaz. He's the meanest." She shook her head violently, tears tracking paths through the glittery face paint my mum had applied earlier. "No," she choked out. "He grabbed me. He tried to pull me into the storage closet." My stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. I knew my cousins. They loved to scare us, but they would never, ever touch anyone. This was a different kind of fear, a real one. The look in Sarah's eyes was not the thrill of a good scare. It was genuine terror. I pulled her out of the basement and found my dad by the donation table. I relayed Sarah's story, my voice shaking as much as hers had been. His face, usually so cheerful, hardened instantly. He and my mom exchanged a look, and they descended into the basement, their movements swift and serious. They rounded up my cousins, pulling them from their hiding spots. "Did any of you grab a little girl?" my dad demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Jeff, Rick, and Chaz, masks now pushed up on their foreheads, all swore they hadn't. They looked confused and concerned. But then my mom did a quick head count. "Where's Eric?" she asked, a new edge of panic in her voice. Just then, Eric himself came clattering down the stairs, his face flushed. "Someone stole my mask," he exclaimed, looking around at his brothers. "I went upstairs to use the bathroom, and when I came back it was gone. I thought one of you guys took it as a joke." The air went still for cousins for masks, but a fifth person, an imposter, had been among them, using their anonymity as a disguise. A chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air swept through the room. My parents didn't hesitate. They shut it down. My dad stood at the top of the stairs, his voice booming as he announced the haunted house was over for the night. There were groans of disappointment, but my parents were firm, ushering everyone out into the night. The police were called. They searched the house and yard with powerful flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness, but they found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no stolen mask. The strange man was gone, as if he had never been there that night. Tucked in my bed, the adrenaline of the evening slowly faded, leaving behind a sticky residue of fear. I tried to push the image of Sarah's terrified face from my mind, telling myself the danger was over. I eventually drifted off, only to be woken sometime later by a sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, rhythmic, and coming from my bedroom window. My room was on the second floor. It had to be a branch, I told myself, a branch scraping against the glass in the wind. I pulled the covers tighter around my chin, my heart starting a slow, heavy drumbeat. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself back to sleep, praying for the sound to stop. After a few agonizing minutes, it did. The silence that replaced it was somehow worse, filled with my own ragged breathing. I must have fallen asleep again, because the next time I woke, it was a different sound. A frantic scratching noise. Scray-ape, scritch scray-ape. It was more urgent, more insistent than the tapping, like an animal trying to claw its way in. It sounded like fingernails on the window frame. A wave of terror so potent it felt like ice water washed through me. But alongside the fear, a hot surge of anger flared up. Someone was trying to scare me in my own room, my sanctuary. In a single defiant motion, I threw back the covers, launched myself out of bed, and stormed to the window. I grabbed the curtain with both hands and yanked it open. My heart stopped, my breath hitched in my throat, pressed against the other. The side of the glass, only inches from my own face, was the blank, white, smiling visage of the anonymous mask. I couldn't see the eyes behind it, but I could feel them. A malevolent, focused gaze boring into me. For a split second, the world seemed to freeze. Then I opened my mouth and screamed, a raw, piercing shriek that tore from the depths of my soul. My parents burst into the room, their faces etched with alarm. I could only point a trembling finger at the window. My dad looked, then ran to the window and threw it open, leaning out into the cold night air. But there was nothing. No one on the roof. No ladder. Nothing. Just the rustling of leaves in the empty yard below. The police came again, their patrol car lights painting strobing, blue and red patterns on my bedroom walls. They searched again. They found nothing. Months passed. The incident faded, becoming a chilling story we told with a shudder, the edges blurred by time. We tried to convince ourselves it was an elaborate prank, a disturbed individual who had moved on. My parents installed new locks and a security system, but slowly, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Then, one afternoon I came home from school, tossed my backpack on the floor, and walked into my room, and there it was. Lying in the very center of my pillow, perfectly placed, was an anonymous mask. It looked exactly like the ones my cousins had worn. My blood ran cold, but it was the details scrawled across the forehead in thick black Sharpie that made me feel like I was going to be sick. In messy block letters, it spelled out my name. How? How had he known my name? How had he gotten into my room? The doors had been locked. My mom was home all day. The police came for a third time, but there was nothing they could do besides file another report and take the mask as evidence. My parents went into overdrive, installing motion-detecting floodlights and sensors on every window, turning our home into a high-tech fortress. But it didn't matter. The violation had already occurred. The fortress had been breached without leaving a single trace. We never had another haunted house. The years went by, and I grew up and moved away, but the fear never truly left. It became a permanent part of me, a cold spot in my soul. I still have nightmares about that blank white face staring at me through the glass. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear a faint scratching sound, and my heart seizes up. It's probably nothing, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there. I never found out who he was, or why he chose me. And I wonder, was the man who dropped off the cans the same man who wore the mask? Had he seen me playing in the yard? Was that why he chose our house? The questions haunt me more than any ghost, because the monster that visited me that Halloween was real, and I know, with a chilling certainty, that he knew my name. I took the job because I was desperate, that's the honest truth. The restaurant was a small family-owned Mexican joint called La Escondida in a part of the next town over that most people avoided after dark. The paint was peeling, and the neon sign of a chili pepper flickered erratically, but the pay was cash and the hours were available. I figured working the closing shift wouldn't be so bad. It meant I had my days free. The only real downside, I thought at the time, was my manager, Carlos. He was a man who seemed permanently stressed, with dark circles under his eyes and a sheen of sweat that never quite left his brow. He was curt, dismissive, and had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were an inconvenience. He scheduled me for the worst hours, kept me late without apology, and generally radiated an aura of shadiness. But I needed the money, so I told myself to just keep my head down and my mouth shut for the first week. The job was exactly what I expected, a blur of mopping greasy floors, cleaning grills, and hauling trash to the dumpster in a poorly lit alley. It was during my second week, late one Tuesday night, that I first heard the noises. The restaurant was empty and quiet, the only sound the hum of the beverage cooler and the slosh of my mop bucket. As I worked my way across the tiled kitchen floor, I picked up on something else, a sound from below my feet. It was a dull, rhythmic thud, 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 like someone gently but persistently bumping against the ceiling from below. It was followed by a faint grating sound, like concrete being scraped with a piece of metal. Thud, thud, scrape. I stopped mopping and stood perfectly still, listening. The sounds were muffled, distorted by the floor between us, but they were undeniably there. It continued for another minute before stopping as abruptly as it began. The silence that rushed back in felt heavier, more menacing. I tried to brush it off. Old building, settling pipes, maybe a raccoon got into the crawlspace, logical explanations, but a seed of unease had been planted. It kept happening. Every night, as the restaurant emptied and the world outside grew quiet, the sounds would return. Always the same pattern, the soft, insistent thudding and the grating scrape. It became a nightly ritual, an unnerving soundtrack to my closing duties. After a few more nights of this, I couldn't take the gnawing curiosity anymore. I found Carlos cashing out the register. "Hey Carlos," I started, trying to sound casual. "This is going to sound weird, but have you ever heard noises coming from the basement?" He didn't even look up from the cash drawer. "There is no basement," he said flatly. "Stop worrying about nothing and finish your work." His immediate, dismissive response set off alarm bells in my head. He was lying. I knew he was lying. I had seen the small, grimy window wells set into the ground around the back of the building when I took out the trash. Those windows went somewhere. I wanted to call him on it, to say, "Then what are those windows for?" But the look on his face, a sudden, hard glint in his eyes, made me hold my tongue. I went back to my mopping, the sounds below seeming louder and more deliberate than ever. Before dark the next day, I confronted him again, more forcefully this time. "Carlos, I know there's a basement. I've seen the windows outside. The noises are getting worse. We should check it out. Maybe an animal is trapped." He finally stopped what he was doing and turned to face me. His expression was a strange mixture of anger and something else, fear. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and firm. "The previous owners sealed that basement, poured concrete down the stairs. There is no way in or out. It's nothing. Now I'm telling you for the last time, focus on your job and stop poking your nose where it doesn't belong." The way he said it, the finality in his tone, sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't a manager telling an employee to get back to work. This was a warning. I dropped it, but the mystery festered in my mind. Why would he lie so fiercely about something so trivial? What was he so desperate to hide? That night, my curiosity finally won out over my fear. After I locked up, instead of going to my car, I walked around to the back of the restaurant, my heart hammering in my chest. I crouched down by one of the filthy window wells, pulling my phone out to use as a flashlight. I pressed the phone against the glass, its beam cutting a weak path into the oppressive darkness beyond. I couldn't see anything but dirt and cobwebs. It was a black, empty void. Just as I was about to give up, convinced Carlos was right, and it was just a sealed-off space, a light flickered on inside. It was a bare bulb, swinging slightly, illuminating the space for a single, breathtaking second. And then it was gone. I scrambled back, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't seen anything clearly, just a flash of a damp, concrete room. But a light meant electricity. A light meant someone had turned it on. I didn't stick around. I ran to my car, my mind racing. I didn't tell Carlos. Some instinct warned me that involving him would be a mistake, that I was on the edge of a secret he would do anything to protect. The next night, I was a wreck. Every creak of the building made me jump. When the thudding and scraping started, it sounded like a desperate plea. I tried to ignore it, blasting music through my headphones, but I couldn't shake the image of that flickering light. Against my better judgment, after I closed, I found myself back at that window. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone steady. I took a deep breath and leaned in close, pressing my face near the cold, grimy glass to get a better look. And then I saw it. A face had emerged from the shadows and pressed itself against the other side of the glass, so close I could see every horrifying detail. It was a man, but he looked barely human. His hair was a wild matted tangle, his face caked in a layer of grime. His yellowed eyes were wide with a frantic, unholy light, and they stared directly into mine. A broken, demented smile spread across his face, revealing cracked, stained teeth. He opened his mouth, and then, with a sickening crack, bashed his forehead against the window. I screamed and fell backward onto the gravel, scrambling away like a crab, my mind unable to process the sheer insanity of what I had just witnessed. I didn't stop running until I was locked safely in my car, speeding away from that place as fast as I could. The next day, I stormed into the restaurant, my terror from the night before having morphed into a cold, hard anger. I cornered Carlos in his office. I saw him. I yelled, my voice shaking. I saw the man in the basement. Who is he? To my astonishment, he didn't deny it. The fight just seemed to drain out of him. He sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He is my brother, he finally admitted, his voice thick with shame and exhaustion. He told me the whole story. His brother Marco was severely mentally ill, prone to violent psychotic episodes. He'd been in and out of institutions for years. Carlos, terrified his brother would end up in prison or worse, had decided to hide him. He had created a secret entrance to the long-sealed basement and turned it into a hidden apartment, a prison, to keep Marco and the world safe from him. The noises I heard were Marco's restless pacing, his moments of rage against his confinement. "Please," Carlos begged, looking up at me with desperate, pleading eyes. "Don't say anything. He's my blood. I'm all he has. Just forget you saw anything. I'll give you a raise." I stood there, torn. Part of me wanted to run out the door and call the police. But another part, the part that was broke and desperate, saw the anguish in this man's face. The idea of starting a new job search was exhausting. Against every rational instinct, I agreed to stay. I told myself it would be fine. I would just do my job, take the money, and stay the hell away from the back of the building. It was a mistake I would regret for the rest of my life. A few weeks later, I was walking to my car after my shift. The parking lot was empty, bathed in the sickly orange glow of a single street lamp. A movement in the tree line at the edge of the lot caught my eye. A figure, standing half hidden in the shadows. My blood ran cold. I knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, who it was. He had gotten out. I pretended not to see him. I kept walking at a steady pace, my hand digging in my pocket for my keys, my fingers fumbling with the cold metal. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Then I heard it, a footstep behind me. A strange, shuffling, dragging footstep, but it was moving with an unnerving speed. I glanced over my shoulder. It was him, Marco. His face was a mask of filth and fury, and he was hobbling towards me, his gait unnatural and jerky, one leg seeming to drag behind him, yet he was closing the distance with terrifying quickness. Panic exploded in my chest. I broke into a run, my keys finally in my hand. I jammed the key into the lock, threw the door open, and hurled myself inside just as he reached the car. He slammed his body against the driver's side door, his deranged face smashing against the window, smearing it with sweat and dirt. He started pounding on the glass with his fists, his mouth open in a silent, guttural roar. I screamed, fumbling with the ignition. The engine roared to life. I slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching on the asphalt, and then sped out of that park a lot, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. That was my last night at La Escondida from the safety of my apartment. Shaking and sobbing, I called the police and told them everything. I never went back. I don't know what happened to Carlos, or to Marco, or to the restaurant. I didn't want to know. I found another job, moved to a different apartment, and tried to erase the memory of that deranged face in my window. But sometimes, late at night, I think about Carlos and his impossible choice, and I think about Marco, hobbling through the darkness. Even now, years later, whenever I'm walking to my car in an empty lot, I can't help but glance over my shoulder, my ears straining for the sound of a dragging footstep, terrified that a family's dark secret might come hobbling out of the shadows for me.